After America is made on the lands of the Kure, Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. So, how's that trade war working out? In the last few days, President Donald Trump announced that the United States had signed a trade deal with China. But of course, read below the headline, and it's not quite that simple. As one White House official explained it, the administration and China agreed to an additional understanding for a framework to implement the Geneva Agreement, which was an agreement they made in May to temporarily lower tariffs. As far as we can tell, this latest agreement is mostly about the export of critical minerals and magnets from China to the United States, stuff the US needs to make semiconductors, cars and, you guessed it, military equipment.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time.
The U.S. economy shrank more than first reported in early 2025, with GDP dropping 0.5% in the first quarter.
Well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, And maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally.
Fed Chair Jerome Powell testified before Congress today where he defended higher interest rates and warned we may only be at the beginning of tariff-induced inflation.
All forecasters are expecting pretty soon that some significant inflation will show up from tariffs. Now, we can't just ignore that.
Trump's trade wars aren't exactly helping the US economy. While he's long said that the economic pain will be worth it, that pain is real. From January to March, US GDP declined by 0.5%. Consumer spending is weak, and Americans are having a harder time finding work. The Chinese economy, meanwhile, isn't exactly suffering for all this. Exports are growing, consumer spending is up, and the economy is now forecast to grow by 5% this year.
The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be.
And the Trump administration still seems to think it can play two separate hands, working out trade deals that benefit the United States with one, while stomping around the Pacific calling China an imminent threat and a malign influence with the other. So, what does all of this mean for Australia? As we record, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong is making her way to Washington. She'll meet with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and participate in meetings of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. The Quad includes Australia, the United States, Japan and India, and it was always designed to counter China, even if it wasn't framed that way.
We'll be going there and doing what the Prime Minister says we always do, which is acting in our national interest, explaining what we are doing and working in partnership with the other members of the Quad.
In DC this week, don't expect to hear heaps of talk about shared democratic values. But you can expect to hear a bit about shared interests. As the Foreign Minister heads to Washington to navigate what has become a very difficult relationship with the United States, Australia's relationship with China will loom large. Writing in The Australian this week, the Chinese ambassador to Australia said that China and Australia are friends, not foes. This has never been in question. Except that it is, all the time. In the very same newspaper, the ambassador's observation that increased defence spending places a heavy fiscal burden on the countries involved was framed as a menacing warning to the Australian government.
The Chinese ambassador speaks for China. My job is to speak for Australia. And it's in Australia's national interest for us to invest in our capability and to invest in our relationships, and we're doing just that.
This week on the show, we wanted to step back and look at Australia's relationship with China, where the United States fits in, and how we might understand our mutual interests. To do that, we're really pleased to welcome a new guest to the show. My friend, Professor James Laurenceson, is the Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship between the two countries. James is an economist, educator and researcher, and a great analyst and commentator on China and the Australia-China relationship. James and I recorded this chat on Friday the 13th of June. before this latest US-China deal was struck, and the US decision to bomb Iran. Bit on. We spoke about the Trump and Biden administration's approaches to China, how Australians think about our relationship with the PRC, and the way we talk about foreign policy here in Australia. Here's James now.
Wonderful to be with you, Emma.
I'm glad to finally have you on. So, James, as we're recording in the last couple of days, the Trump administration has signed a big, new, beautiful trade deal with China that's not quite finalised yet at the time of recording. But I wanted to start by asking you what you make of this deal, I suppose, and whether you buy into the pretty common argument that Trump backed down on his China tariffs.
Well, I'll take the latter one first, Emma. And did he back down? For sure. And he backed down earlier this month in Geneva as well. So this idea that I'm very much of the view that in this trade dispute, Beijing has escalation dominance, right? So if Trump wants to play this hard, that's not Beijing's preference, but I have a very high degree of confidence that they will be confident in their ability to withstand those impacts. Look, as you know, plenty of economists have said, if Trump kept those tariffs at 145% or whatever they got up to, clearly that would hurt China. No arguing about that. There'd be plenty of lost sales. But of course, what we see in the US is something, I think, even politically more challenging. We see empty shelves and inflation. And China's a big economy, Emma. It's $19 trillion economy now. Exports to the US are actually less than 2% of China's GDP. So again, I'm not trying to trivialize this. This would hurt China. But the idea that in 2025, a US administration can use economic coercion to bring Beijing to its knees, I mean, goodness me, those days are long gone. And Beijing well and truly understands that. And it's not just me. I was listening to the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia a couple of weeks ago. He'd recently been to China and he delivered that exact same assessment.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that the Trump administration, or maybe Trump in particular, has kind of misjudged this and actually, and we've talked about this before on the pod, just fundamentally misunderstands basic concepts like supply and demand. There's been a lot made of the continuity between the Biden administration and the Trump administration on China, but it appears to be that that's maybe not the case now because of that kind of fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the relationship.
Yeah, mind you, Emma, I think there were some fairly fundamental misunderstandings of the relationship during the Biden administration as well. And as you said, there has been a lot of continuity. I mean, Biden kept all those Trump 1.0 tariffs in place, introduced a few more export controls of their own, jacked up tariffs on a couple of other goods like electric vehicles. Trump's come along, you know, he's put in place some more tariffs. So there is a lot of continuity there. But honestly, Emma, when I listen to folks in Washington talk about China these days, the US has a lot of wonderful people. I mean, there's a lot of US voices that I respect enormously. People like, you know, Ryan Haas, for example. They're fantastic. But when I listen to the administration, I am desperately hoping that the Australian government is coming to its own assessments, because it doesn't seem to me as if these folks have a good grasp on reality in 2025.
Yeah, that's a very succinct way to put it. We have spoken before on the pod about the, I guess, the kind of ideological makeup, I suppose, of the Trump administration, particularly when it comes to China. And we've had a few people come on, including Americans, and talk about how the Trump effectively stacked his administration with China hawks. Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard a lot in the last little while. We've heard a bit about Elbridge Colby defence, and he's a well-known China hawk. Of course, some of the China hawks have also been moved on, right? So, you know, former national security advisors, Mike Waltz and so on.
Yeah.
But the big question in that, and this is something you know well, Emma, is there may be China hawks in the administration, but how much power do they wield? And it's pretty clear that Trump is the one wielding the decision-making power. So even if there are China hawks there, I'm not so sure that means we can confidently assess that they're going to drive the direction of the second Trump administration. I still think we have that fundamental challenge, and no one knows the answer. On the one hand, Trump clearly has some antagonism towards China. And as we just said, there's some in his administration that most certainly do. But then, on the other hand, Trump's also pretty attracted to a deal. I mean, let's face it, tomorrow, if Trump struck a big grand bargain with Xi Jinping, you wouldn't be shocked, would you? I mean, that would certainly be one of the very reasonable prospects on the cards. You wouldn't rate that at less than 10%, right? It may not be 50%, but it's not going to shock anyone.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. He loves the political theatre of those kinds of meetings and deals. I guess, does that explain then the way that the administration's policies on Chinese students in particular has played out? So we've had this attack on Harvard University, Marco Rubio kind of talking about aggressively rescinding the visas of Chinese students, framing them as agents of the Chinese Communist Party. And now Trump posting just in the last couple of days that, he was always fine with Chinese students coming. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, what we can certainly say is a lot of the, the fire and fury in the initial announcement quickly dissipates, right? We've seen that across a number of policy announcements, whether it's tariffs, and as you started off this discussion talking about, we've seen a bit of a de-escalation on that front. And as you just mentioned, we seem to be seeing some of that on the student front as well. And now there's even talk that some of those export controls that were actually introduced during the Biden administration, Trump might be prepared to walk some of those back as well. So yeah, I think we can say with a high degree of conviction that what ends up happening is routinely quite different from the initial whiz-bang announcement.
Yeah. Does that expose, though, my next question, James, was going to be about what are American objectives when it comes to China. But does that expose a kind of contradiction in the aims of Trump himself, who, as you said quite correctly, kind of is driving, not policy, but driving what happens, and the aims of the broader administration? Because we've had Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, kind of marching around in Shangri-La talking about the imminent threat of China, but then you have Trump making these deals. Is this a case of contradictory objectives?
Of course it is, because if you genuinely believed, if you were of one mind that China was going to take its big, massive economy and convert that into military power, if that was your firm assessment, your economic policy would look very different to what Trump is talking about, right? You would be looking to decouple your economy from China as quickly as you possibly could. You'd be looking at containing China's economic rise in every possible way you could, and that's not what we're seeing. But even as I say that, if you ask me, is the weight of U.S. policy, where does the weight of U.S. policy lie? I think there is a lot of policy coming out of Washington, particularly under the Biden administration, that is focused on China's economic containment. So you see the U.S. sort of swinging between these views, and it comes out in a very muddled way. And of course, this is the massive challenge for Australia, because it's not even clear that the US knows what's going on. So how the heck can we line up, firmly in support of a US administration that it's not clear to anyone, including themselves, where they're heading on their China policy?
Yeah, what a mess. I absolutely want to ask you about Australia, but just before I do, I wanted to ask you what the Chinese government makes of all of this, because that question is actually quite extraordinary how rarely that question is asked. We make all kinds of assumptions about what China is doing, but rarely ask how that confusion, that mess that is coming out of the United States is actually being viewed by the Chinese government. And I think you're better placed than most people in this country to explain that.
Well, I don't know if I can tell you the mind of Xi Jinping, but what I can tell you is I was just in Beijing just last week, and if you speak to some, well-informed folks over there, there is a lot of fundamental confusion, but more importantly, there is quite a strong degree of confidence that China's best path is that whatever the US is doing, China's path is pretty stable. They don't see any desperate need to change from that. And I can also say that, any 20 years ago, I think there would have been quite a lot of Chinese people who would look on the US with a high degree of admiration. Now, I think you've got a whole bunch of Chinese people just looking at this place and just thinking, oh my goodness, like we do not want to become like them, right? So if that's what a liberal democracy looks like, no thanks. And I'm not talking about Chinese Communist Party officials. I'm just talking about pretty regular, well-informed folks. And frankly, you can't blame them. And even actually, when I look around Australia, that's broadly the mood of the Australian public as well. Yeah. I mean, Emma, you've done some polling at the Australia Institute, I remember a couple months ago, and from memory, a greater proportion of Australians considered Donald Trump a bigger threat to world peace than Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Now, I'm not so sure how accurate that assessment is, but in terms of the vibe, in terms of the mood, I don't think it's China just looking at the US in that way. I think that's broadly shared across many parts of the world, including liberal democracies.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Pew's done some research that basically came back with that exact result across the United States, traditional allies and otherwise. The global view of the United States is pretty grim.
Facing these threats, we know that many countries are tempted by the idea of seeking both economic cooperation with China and defense cooperation with the United States. Now, that is a geographic necessity for many. But beware the leverage that the CCP seeks with that entanglement. Economic dependence on China only deepens their malign influence and complicates our defense decision space during times of tension. Nobody knows what China will ultimately do, but they are preparing. And therefore, we must be ready as well.
Does that mean you think that the Chinese government, I guess, is seeing Pete Hegseth's marching around at Shangri-La that we were just talking about in that context, or would that have been viewed as an escalation, I suppose, of at least the rhetoric coming out of the administration?
Emma, the way I describe it is I don't think there would have been anyone in the Chinese government surprised by that rhetoric coming out of Hegseth. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty standard Biden language, right? So there was nothing really shocking that Hegseth said that was different to what we've heard from the previous administration. And at the same time, I think they would recognise that as long as Trump's the president, whatever the Minister of Defence is saying, there is always the possibility of striking a broader deal. So they would be certainly keeping that option open.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn to Australia now because you've mentioned Australia a few times, and particularly the need for Australia and the Australian government to make its own assessment and not tie ourselves to American interests in China.
What Pete Hegseth said in terms of encouraging more spending on defence is entirely consistent with the way in which the Americans have been speaking to all their friends and allies.
We ask, and indeed we insist, that our allies and partners do their part on defence.
What you should do in defence is decide what you need, your capability, and then provide for it. What we don't do is do what the opposition did during the election campaign, where they announced an amount of money. They couldn't say where the money was coming from, and they couldn't say what it was for.
Maybe let's start, or stay, I suppose, with the Secretary of Defence, Pete Hegseth, because symbolically, I think that was really important, that Hegseth was there talking about China as an imminent threat and at the same time demanding that Australia increase its defence spending to 3.5% of GDP or whatever stupid number he said. What did you make of that whole incident, kind of how it played out, I suppose, and how the Australian government responded?
Yeah, so I thought there was an element of nastiness to it because we know that Miles didn't reveal the conversation, right? It was revealed by Hegseth on the US side. And so that just gave all the appearances of a US administration trying to use the media to put the hard word on Australia. So look, I haven't spoken to Richard Marles in the last week, but if I was him and if I was Albo, I'd be pretty darn annoyed. And I think it would actually make me more resistant to bowing to that sort of pressure. In terms of how the government's handled it, pretty well, in my opinion, Emma. I mean, I'm broadly speaking, there's always areas you can complain about, but Albo's response that, we'll make the decisions based on the capability that we need. He's clearly balancing across multiple areas. He's just not locked in on defence. There's health and education to worry about as well. And at the same time, you've got this backdrop, and Albanese said this quite directly several times. You've got our major security ally acting in a way that is not as a friend, right? So the idea that the Australian government would even, would acquiesce to a country that is behaving very poorly to Australia, I don't think that's the instinct of the current government, and I think that's right. So, yeah, broadly, at least in terms of what the government is saying, I'm pretty on board with it.
Yeah, right. And does that extend more broadly to the way that the government is assessing and handling Australia's relationship with China?
For sure. Honestly, if I had to give the Albanese government a mark out of 10 for diplomacy, it would be, it'd be 8.5.
It's very high.
There are clear differences. And this is actually something I have to tell my Chinese colleagues all the time, because in China, you always hear this line that Australia just follows the US. Well, no, actually, it really doesn't. I know if you are fixated on the security space, if you were just looking at AUKUS, for example, you might come to that view. Fine, I'm not pretending that element doesn't exist. But more broadly, the Australian government has consistently taken a very different approach. I mean, you probably know I'm an economist, and in that area, we've long run a different track to Washington. You've never seen an Australian Prime Minister, even Scott Morrison, talk about the desirability of containing China's economic rise or being on board with those sorts of policies. Most notably under Penny Wong, you've had a foreign minister that very explicitly says that Australia's national interest lies in being at every table where regional economic integration is discussed, and that includes with China. Just after the election, you had Don Farrell, our trade minister, come out and say this. I've got the quote in front of me, Emerson. Let me just read it out word for word. Quote, "We want to do more business with China. We'll make decisions about how we continue to engage with China based on our national interests and not on what the Americans may or may not want." Don Farrell said things like that before. When the Biden administration put in place export controls on China in October 2022, trying to cut off China's access to advanced semiconductors, Don Farrell the next day came out and described them as draconian. I mean, this is strong language from
I didn't
Canberra.
clock that at the time.
Yeah, and even back in 2018, when you had a coalition government and Simon Birmingham was the trade minister, and the Trump 1.0 started the trade war February 2018 and put in place some tariffs on Chinese imports. Again, the next day, Simon Birmingham came out and said very explicitly, we do not support these unilateral US tariffs on Chinese goods. So, yeah, we have long run a different track to Washington, and I think that's only becoming more stark now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In terms of navigating the relationship, Australia's relationship with China, you mentioned Scott Morrison and export controls as well. And of course, that's been something that framed the relationship between Australia and China, at least for a little while, in terms of trade restrictions on things like lobsters during COVID. Do you think that's had a lasting impact on the relationship?
Yeah, it's not something that you can quickly forget. I mean, whenever I speak to Chinese diplomats, I'm very frank. I think that was a massive own goal from Beijing to engage in that activity. Don't get me wrong. I can understand why Beijing was annoyed with Scott Morrison, the Morrison government, particularly the way they handled diplomacy. But still, it's your choice how you respond to that, and you can respond to it through diplomatic measures. Or you can start attacking Australian businesses who have got absolutely nothing to do with what the Morrison government is saying or doing. Beijing chose that option. So that was a big mistake, and Australian businesses won't quickly forget it. Emma, if I could just, on that point, can I just jump in and say just one more thing?
Of course.
I am concerned, though, there is this view, and I hear this particularly from security and strategic folks who look at the economic or the trade exposure Australia has to China. So, about 35% of our exports go to China. And they say, oh dear, the massive exposure, that means we have a massive risk. That trade, dependence, quote unquote, is a big risk. Absolutely wrong, right? For a couple reasons. First of all, Australia and China are actually, we're not dependent on China, we're mutually interdependent, right? So all the big ticket items in the trade relationship, iron ore, LNG, lithium, wool, and so on, they kept flowing as normal because Beijing didn't want to touch those because it just would have been a massive shock to China's own economy. And then there are about a dozen goods. So this was a good whack at economic coercion by Beijing at Australia, about a dozen goods that were hit. But overwhelmingly, the goods that were hit, the cost to the Australian economy was basically zero because China was only willing to hit those goods because it had other supplier options. Well, guess what? Australia had other buyer options. So when China said, we don't want your coal, Australian coal producers just kind of shrugged their shoulders and thought, oh, that's disappointing. Overnight, virtually no cost, boom, redirected our exports elsewhere. Now, there were a couple industries, wine and lobster, that were hard hit, but there was literally no options for those companies. For example, China accounts for more than 90% of global live rock lobster imports. So where were our lobster fishers going to diversify their exports? And in the end, the macroeconomic impact of that is basically zero. So yeah, I'll stop there. But the point that, the idea that exposure equals risk is just a shockingly uninformed assessment. And sadly, I hear that far too much.
Yeah, I am so glad you brought that up because I encounter it all the time as well in a very similar way. Even in the last couple of days, as we're recording, the Trump administration has put the AUKUS submarine deal to a review. And so, the security establishment is kind of frothing itself into an absolute tears about this. But I encounter, and I'm sure you do as well, James, this kind of framing of the relationship, Australia's relationship with China and of the US as being all about security, that security trumps everything else. And so I encounter this binary when it comes to Australian foreign policy and how it's framed that, either we are kind of all the way with the United States, we're all in, or the next day we're living under Chinese Communist Party dictatorship. Is that your experience? And if it is, how do you deal with that? How do you respond to it?
Whenever I'm asked the question, what's the one thing I wish Australia appreciated more thoroughly about our relationship with China, it is that complexity, all right? So in other words, that binary is just wrong. And, I think we saw an example of this when Albanese recently appeared at the National Press Club, and there was a journalist who got up at the end to ask him a question, and he asked the question, look, Prime Minister, can you just call China a threat? And Albanese resisted, and I think he resisted very wisely. That's not because he doesn't think there are security threats from China, but he refuses to frame the entire relationship through that one prism. And I think he's exactly right to be doing that. I mean, it would be just as logical for a journalist to stand up and say, Albanese, do you think China's a wonderful opportunity for Australia? Like if China's a threat, okay, well, they're a wonderful opportunity too. So don't try and pigeonhole the relationship into a simplistic, ignorant binary like that. And look, that's another example where I think, broadly speaking, the government's doing a pretty good job.
And it seems to be as well in line generally with community sentiment too. I think the mainstream media that frames things in binaries that way often assumes that that's how all Australians think about Australia's relationship with China. But you've also done some polling that suggests Australians appreciate the exact kind of complexity you were just outlining.
Yeah, for sure. So we've now done an annual opinion poll for 4 years running. Goes into a lot of depth. But the big headline finding is that if you ask Australians, do you have concerns, do you have fears about Australia's relationship with China, about 2/3 of Australians will say yes. But then if you ask them, do you think Australia should forge closer ties with China? Guess what? 2/3 of Australians say yes. And I don't think that means they're confused. I think that means they're exactly right. They understand that there are challenges, there are differences, but guess what? Those jobs, that income, that trade with China brings, that's real. Those vibrant cultural exchanges, from people to people exchanges, they are of great benefit to Australia. The Australian public get it. I think the current Albanese government gets it, but unfortunately not all in our commentariat or media get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's true as well of how Australians generally view our relationship with the United States. There's quite a lot of complexity there. And I think, it's changing quite rapidly in response to the Trump administration. But I think we've seen that oversimplification of people's views play out, again, just this week in coverage of this AUKUS review as well. Is that how you've seen it too?
Yeah, definitely. I was just reminded then when you were talking about there was an essential poll done last year, and they asked the Australian public this exact question. How do you principally think about the China relationship? And here's the results. I've got it in front of me. 67% of Australians described it as a complex relationship to be managed, right? Just 20% said it was a threat to be confronted, and 13% said it was a positive opportunity to be realised, right? So that's the exact point we're making. Good on the Australian public, right? They've got it right. On the kerfuffle over the latest, AUKUS developments, you're right, Emma. I have seen a whole bunch of folks come out and try and frame this in very simplistic terms as well. For example, one of the lines I've heard is that the Australian public are overwhelmingly on board with Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. There was some data out of the Lowy Institute. Said 67%. Well, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Well, not really, because if you ask the same people whether acquiring those submarines were worth the cost, the numbers completely flip. For example, this is some previous Lowy polling. I'm not sure if they've asked the same question in their poll this year, but just 27% of Australians said the cost of acquiring AUKUS submarines was worth it. Well, 47% said that it wasn't, and 27% said that they didn't know. There's other polling out of the US Study Centre as well that comes to similar findings. September last year, 39% of Australians agreed that AUKUS submarines were not worth the cost, while just 25% disagreed. So that simplistic headline, 67% of Australians support acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, well, please, can you at least contextualise that? Those submarines aren't free. And so once you that's right. Once you ask Australians to consider the cost, they say, oh, actually, no, not worth it. So, yeah, it's a very annoying binary discussion we get into, whether it's on the security or the economic side of the equation.
Annoying is the word, James. I have to totally agree. I guess that brings me to, a final question. I think you and I occupy a similar space in that we talk a lot about Australian foreign policy and Australia's role in the world, but I don't think we could be considered insiders in terms of, I guess, the Australian sort of national security establishment. And I just wanted to ask you, I guess, a broad question about how you experience that and whether you see conversations about Australian foreign policy and Australia's role in the world changing and opening up.
Look, Emma, I'd say it's certainly better than it was 5 years ago. My sense was that 5 years ago, the Morrison government in particular was simply not interested in engaging with anyone outside of government that wasn't cheerleading their positions. Just to be very frank about that. Under the Albanese government, the extent of exchanges between government and think tanks like yours and university research centres like mine is still not on the level that I'd want. But look, I engage with folks in the Australian government regularly, whether it's, we hosted the Australian Trade Minister for an event a couple of months ago. We hosted the Shadow Foreign Minister, the Shadow Trade Minister last year. I'm regularly in touch with Australian diplomats, currently serving in China. So it does seem to me that there's a bit more of an appetite now. The Australian government is not where I get the most. It's members of the commentariat. I think that's where some of the nastiness can get really strong. I'm not sure of your personal experience, but I've had death threats, legal threats, all this sort of stuff. It's pretty nasty. I think many of us have. But that's not, can't blame the Australian government for that. And in fact, let me give a shout out to some of our officials. Even when I listen to folks like Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, talking, his commentary, his analysis on China is far more measured and far more informed than a lot of the other commentary I see coming out of security and strategic think tanks. So I think it's important that we don't lump all the hawks in one big bucket because, frankly, I don't think they are. I think there's some, people who have hawkish views on China that are nonetheless capable of seeing some of that complexity in a way that there's certain other voices who just, appear incapable of understanding.
A friend of the show, Matt Duss from the Centre for International Policy in the States, describes that quite nicely, I think, as separating the signal from the noise. So On that note, I will say, James, thank you so much for helping us separate the signal from the noise about Australia and the United States' very complex relationships with China.
Thanks very much, Emma. Great to talk with you.
If you want to read more, you can order your copy of our inaugural Vantage Point essay. In the first edition, After America, Australia and the New World Order, I explore the future of our alliance with the United States. You can purchase the first edition or become a foundation subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. If you're based in Melbourne, I'll be in conversation about the essay with Dr Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute at the University of Melbourne on the 16th of July. You can register via the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Friday the 13th of June. A bunch of stuff has changed since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.